just as the Speaker leaves, I have to say some of what he said echoes with me in terms of my own personal experience. However, I totally disagree with him. Let me say I agree with him in relation to lack of accountability, in relation to reviews not being carried out properly. It absolutely merges with my own experience. I've raised some of those matters in the Dáil. But when he extends that to say that politicians have no responsibility or the government, I have to fundamentally disagree with him. And we're here to re-establish an independent board as a monitoring mechanism over the health executive. And that's good, Minister, and I support that. However, having said that, one has to ask, why was there no board? How long has there been no board for? And how did that happen? And the very deputy that's left was part of the government that made the decision in 2012, walked into the health executive, walked into the independent board and told them they were dissolved. And they replaced it with civil servants. And then I'm going to come to some of the consequences of that. But why we're re-establishing that board tonight, which is almost 7 years later from the time it was dissolved, three reasons really, and two are interconnected. One is the Connolly report that clearly outlined the consequences of bad governance, particularly in relation to the board not being there and no representation. And the second thing is the Sláinte Care report, which is made up of cross-party members and reflects a new Dáil and a new type of politics. And I'm still, let's say, innocent enough to believe in new politics, even though the cynical side of tells me that we're going nowhere. But I'll stay with the innocent side tonight and the Sláinte Care report that clearly said we need an independent board. That's one of the reasons why we are here. I'd like to think we were here because the government had learned, and the government were here tonight saying we made a terrible mistake at the time. Minister O'Reilly thought he was doing the right thing, but it wasn't a good thing. But I don't hear that being used. And the second thing then is in relation to the Connolly report, which I'm going to quote from because I think it's important, because in the height, and I was part of that, I contributed to that debate, but in the height of that debate about the cervical cancer and how it happened and the failure, the patronising attitude and the failure to give information, because at the end of the day that's what it was about, the failure to give information to women, to empower them and to let them make decisions. But in that report, and I read it closely, it's scathing and in very moderate language in relation to the absence of governance. And in fairness to the cervical check programme, another point is noted, that within a few days of the launching of the cervical screening, the bank guarantee, staff recounted how the Irish bank guarantee occurred 3 days after cervical check was launched nationally in September 2008. As the financial crisis contributed to the economic recession, public sector programmes and organisations saw a reduction in the level of resources afforded to them, with cervical check no different. As its budget was reduced, cervical check struggled to adequately replace departing staff. Now that was the background, and why I'm mentioning that in the context of tonight was because even with those difficulties, it struggled on gallantly until it was put back under the remit of the health executive in 2010. And he clearly says, since 2010, cervical check has not had a single accountable senior person responsible for the delivery of the programme on a full-time basis. Now, at that point, we did have an independent board, but we were in trouble with cervical check because there was no accountable person. And on top of that, Minister O'Reilly at the time, and I don't wish to personalise it, but he happened to be the minister who walked in 2012 and dissolved the board. And so what level of accountability was supposedly there in theory was also taken away. And we put civil servants in charge. And then we went into 2013 and a Fine Gael and Labour government brought in legislation that copper-fastened the absence of monitoring, accountability and holding a system to account. And what did they put in place? A Director General going into a room to be answerable to other directors of services, and when he came out he was answerable to himself and ultimately the Minister. And all of this was done in debates that said this was to bring more openness and accountability. And from 2013 to date, you, Minister, are as aware as I am of the many, many mistakes made. My own family have suffered, and I'm not going into it here, but I've alluded to it on a number of occasions, and I will be coming back to it in terms of the failure to independently review when something happens. And on that alone, the hospital in Galway has acknowledged, I've asked a simple question: how many reviews independently have been carried out within a certain period of time? Who were they carried out by, and what was the cost? And the answer has come back: we have no system for recording that information. That's the official reply to a Dáil question. Again, that's relevant in a minute when I come back to the board that we're going to re-establish, because the first hurdle is to get the board. The second hurdle is to make sure that the board is functioning adequately, that it has adequate data, adequate help, adequate research facilities, and so on. In relation to the actual absence of, I'm going to just stay with Scally for a moment, and I'm going to quote him because I think it's important to balance, and I want to balance exactly some of the things I said at the time. Changes to the overall governance of the Health Executive had a significant impact. In March 12, the board of the Health Executive, which had consisted of external non-executive chair and board members, was removed by a board and replaced by a board consisting of civil servants and health service officials. The change from the accepted good practice of having independent board members in an oversight role and involved in a committee structure beneath the board was a major move away from the established norms of good governance of public bodies. It is difficult to see who, under this configuration, was representing the patient and public interest. And again, this is something I'm going to come back to if time permits. Talking about putting on patient representatives, it's not sufficient to represent a patient. A lot more is necessary in relation to an independent board. But I'm going to continue for the moment. In the case of the civil servants, and this is Dr. Scally, in the case of the civil servants appointed as board members, it raises the question of whether they are acting in their civil service capacity, supporting ministers to carry out government policy, or are they there to administer a major public body in the interest of the public it serves? This was further compounded by senior civil servants at times fulfilling two roles, one in a senior executive position in the Department of the Health and the other within the top-level governance structure of the Health Executive. Again, he's clearly illustrating the difficulty at that time, and it's something I'm going to come back to, again, in terms of appointments and conflicts of interest on any new board. In 2013, legislation changed the nature of the governance of the Health Executive entirely, replacing the board, as I said, with the director and other directors. This was supposed to be part of the initial beginning of the abolition of the Health Executive, which never happened. But no politician or member of government came back in and said, look, the Health Executive hasn't been abolished, so we need to put back an independent board to monitor it. Nobody came back in to do that. It has taken Sláinte here, and it has taken Dr. Scally, and it has taken the loss of lives, including somebody close to me, to realise that we need an independent review board, not for the purposes that Deputy O'Dowd was talking about, because they're for independent reviews. That's an entirely separate matter, and he's confounding and conflating issues in his emotional address to the Dáil, which I fully understand. But the independent board has a different function. And so the effect of removing the board by legislation supported by the majority of the House and led by Fine Gael and Labour, the net effect was to remove external independent input into the running of the Health Executive at its highest level. That was the net effect. Absolutely no independent input or no independent monitoring. And that's the way we have progressed. And I make my contribution tonight in the context of a health service that's absolutely struggling. 73 children on trolleys so far this year and we're barely 2.5 weeks into the 2019, 73 children. Now, I hope a time never comes where I accept that as collateral damage of a thriving economy, because I certainly do not. And I do not think you can have 73 children on trolleys and talk about a thriving economy. And we've thrown out all the other figures. For Galway alone, in last year, 8,750 patients on trolleys, on chairs, and on other types of contraptions up in wards. Galway distinguishes itself by having, despite the best efforts of staff, of having the most appalling record for patients on trolleys. And bear in mind, as I said earlier, Dr. Hickey, the brave consultant that he is, has repeatedly pointed out that every year we have between 300 and 350 deaths prematurely because directly consequent on the time spent on trolleys. And we're having this debate in the context of nurses, and we're appealing to nurses through the government not to strike because of patient care issues. And we're missing the very point that the reason they're on strike or promising to go on strike is because they're concerned about patient safety and because patients are dying as a result of inadequate care because there aren't enough staff and lots of mistakes are being made. For the second time tonight, I want to thank the Library Service for their very detailed report, the Oireachtas Library and Research Service. I think it's very important to compliment staff when they an excellent job. And they've given the whole history, and along with Dr. Scally. And what I see, and it's something that has always jumped out on me, but I didn't have the language for it, but I do, thanks to the Library and Research. They talk about the necessary or the characteristics or the qualities that are essential for a good board. And they've looked at international literature and they have simplified it for us and given the key characteristics. And it's worth looking at it, but they call it, the synonym is TAPIC, transparency, accountability, participation, integrity and capacity. And they look at that internationally and they come back. And when I look at that, what jumps out from the page is that many, many boards are caught looking at financial issues and looking at key performance indicators given by government. And when the literature tells us that one of the better characteristics of a board is when they look at patient safety. And when that's actually on each agenda of every single board's meeting, that they're looking at patient safety. So the hurdle is to set up, but it's only the initial hurdle. The second hurdle is to make sure that that independent board is representative, that it has gender equality, but more than that, that they have people that have the capacity to absorb knowledge, ask questions and hold the system to account. That is the role of an independent directorate. And I reread with fascination the former Director General of the Health Executive who got huge prominence in the Business Post. And actually I found myself agreeing with some things that he said, but other things, including his comment that the SHIT only went one way, uphill to him, was an extraordinary comment. But he made other comments as well. He talked about the abolition of the independent board, but he actually didn't look at the consequences of that for himself. He didn't look at it at all. He also commented on one day in 2012, the very year that Minister O'Reilly got rid of the board, the Health Executive lost 5% of its staff in one day. It lost all that experience, all that wisdom, gone out the door because of cutbacks. Those cutbacks went on before you, Minister. I absolutely say that on the record. They went on when I was on a health forum in Galway. Only the language was different in 2007 and 2008. And we had words like cost containment measures, bed refurbishment measures, when we asked why beds were empty or wards were closed. And all of the time, of course, the privatisation of the service was intensifying. And here we have yourselves and Fine Gael repeatedly talking about the National Treatment Purchase Fund and how wonderful it is. It was to be a temporary measure. It wasn't to be a permanent measure. It was to be a temporary. But the opposite happened and we ran down the public system. So I'm going to finish by saying I welcome the bill. I hope it's implemented as quickly as possible, but then the picking of the board is extremely important. The services to the board are extremely important. Of course, gan in áras tá gá le daoine le Gaeilge. Tá dúlgais reachtaúil an rialtas agus aon word Gaeilge úsáid agus Gaeilge Corcan cin, so glacum go mai Gaeilge an aon nos. But in addition, like I said, there has to be expertise and research available. There has to be a clear evidence that the people appointed, men or women, have the ability to ask questions, that are not afraid, and the top of the agenda is that patients are first. And finally, in relation to conflicts of interest, and again I go back to the former Director General of the Health Executive, and he saw no problem in the fact that he had taken a position on a certain pharmaceutical company. All public knowledge, Minister, so we don't need to worry about me straying outside of anything. He saw no difficulty with that, nor apparently did the government see any difficulty that the chair of that pharmaceutical company was also chair of one of the hospital groups. Now, that type of conflict of interest, to me, that's a conflict of interest. Perhaps other people disagree with me, but they're the type of things in a small country that we have to be particularly aware of. And the final point that came out from the research that I looked at from the library was in relation to oversight of the actual independent board itself. And we know this week after week in the prison sentence that we have on the public accounts, which is both a prison sentence and a privilege. And what comes out every single week are the difficulties arising from lack of governance, or even when the governance procedures are in place, the failure to monitor those. And we get tied up with all of this governance words, but the actual consequence on the ground is that patients suffer and patients die. In relation to other groups that come before us, the whistleblowers suffer, the employees suffer, and at the end of the day, the public purse suffers because of inquiry after inquiry. I have lost count in my brief time on the Public Accounts Committee of just over 2 years how many independent inquiries there have been, nothing to do with health, but to do with, separate from health, the VECs, the universities, the technological colleges. They're costing us a fortune, all because we have not managed to implement good governance. And even when we do in theory, we do not ensure that it's implemented on the ground, and it costs us more in the end. So I welcome it, and I look forward to the further discussion at committee level.